pleased that you managed to find your way through locked doors and the green and yellow corridor. And I'm also very pleased that we have this distinguished panel today to celebrate a very special occasion. This is both the annual school seminar of our research center on migration, refugees and belonging, but also together with the Center for Cultural Studies we are celebrating the memory of Stuart Hall and the fact that the Stuart Hall Foundation have selected us because of our relationship to his life work to be the recipient of one of the PhD Studentship that they are raising funds of. And next month, as some of you know, on March 9th, there is the book launch of the edited works of Stuart, which Sally here from Lawrence and Bishada is also selling some of the first copies even before the launch, which is going to happen on March 9th in the Stratford campus of UEL. I think a lot of us are missing Stuart, not just because of the amazing work that he's been doing, but also him as a person, as his kindness and warmth, as well as, of course, very sharp intellectual insights have, I think, affected lots and lots of people. And the four speakers this afternoon have had have been influenced, but also important in terms of the legacy of Stuart Hall work. I first met Stuart Hall in the first sociological conference that I came to Britain in '74. And it was in Aberdeen, and it was a very special conference because this is when I fell in love with sociology and knew why I want to be a sociologist. After studying it, both at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and in Harvard, in Cambridge, Mass, and I did not really understand why I want to be a sociologist until, on the one hand, I got exposed to feminist sociology at that conference, and on the other hand, had heard Stuart speaking and explaining what is sociology from his then version of what Marxist sociology was. And this is where I met also After Gra, who has had a lifelong, I think, dialogical relationship with Stuart Hall, influencing as well as being influenced by his work. I will never forget his speech in her retirement conference. And then Phil Cohen also, that Stuart Hall had been one of the, when he was in Birmingham, had been one of the first to recognize the importance of field work. And on the other hand, Phil, when he arrived to UEL all these years ago, established a center for new ethnicities, which was very much influenced by the analysis of Stuart Hall during the 80s. And Ash here, he has been involved in the Cultural Studies Center, which, of course, the whole discipline of cultural studies have been developed and pioneered by Stuart Hall work. And Gary Young might not be an academic, but I think there are very few people that the insights of his work, whether academic or not academic, has not influenced us, I think, in a very similar direction to the work of Stuart. So I think we are all very much looking forward to hear. But we don't want just to hear the people, we want to have a real conversation. Actually, it was a condition that Gary gave me when he agreed to speak about it, but we plan to do it anyway. Each of the speakers are going to talk for about 15 minutes. and then we will start a conversation with the people, among the people in the panel, and with you in the audience. The event is being streamed live. This is the first event of CMW which is streamed live as well as being recorded for the website, and we would love to get feedback to this, the effect of streaming live, because I know several people have not come today when they heard that it's going to be streamed live, and hopefully are now following us. I will reserve the right as a chair to intervene and make some comments or questions in order to allow the directions of the conversation. But please, I encourage you all to take active part. And at the end, as you've seen, we have some refreshment. So the speakers are going to be in the order of the panel, and I will let people know when they have to kind of wind up the discussion. So, Tara, you're first. Okay.
Do you want us to go there or to sit here?
Whatever you prefer. But is there a quality of sound?
Can you hear me?
Also,
yeah, good.
Yeah.
That's
okay.
That's lovely. Okay. Well, it's 3 years now since Stuart died. And over the last 3 years since his death, whenever I have spoken about him in public, I've started by sharing an anecdote about when I first met him. This is because the anecdote illustrates the kind of a person he was. As students embarking on our PhDs, 3 of us decided that we would visit Stuart Hall in Birmingham, where he was director of the Center of Cultural Studies. Totally in awe of him, and intimidated by the prospect of meeting such a renowned figure, we were not sure when, or indeed whether, we would succeed in getting an appointment with him. Of course, we needn't have worried, because despite his immensely busy schedule, he made time for an early appointment with us. Our visit to the Center for Cultural Studies was memorable, not only because of the excitement generated by holding conversation with him, but also because of the warmth with which he greeted us. And this was really, really very important. And the encouragement he gave to our fledgling ideas. He asked us questions, listened to us carefully, as if we were well-established scholars. Few intellectuals of his stature are that generous with their time, and sharing of ideas and insight. Our encounter demonstrates how much interest he took in students. He was a brilliant teacher, galvanizing his students with incisive analysis, mixed with a very good dose of wit and humor. Who can forget, if you knew him, who can forget his laughter? That he was totally committed to education and his students is so appropriate to the fact that we are gathered here today to honor Stuart Hall UEL PhD Studentship. Hall generally respected and valued each individual equally for their uniqueness, even when he might have disagreed with them intellectually or politically. He was interested in power dynamics of social relations of the everyday, of how ordinary lives are lived. It is perhaps this outlook of Stuart Hall which focused his analytical and political optic on the subaltern, the marginalized, the othered, even as he analyzed the hegemonic moves of the powerful. Contrary to the stereotypic image of an ivory tower academic, Hall was first and foremost committed to academic collaboration and conversation. Indeed, much of the work published under his directorship of the Center for Cultural Studies at Birmingham University was undertaken collaboratively. Such collaborative approaches are somewhat rare in the neoliberal universities of today. Although I admire all aspects of Hall's work, I'm particularly attracted by the way in which he places questions of race, ethnicity, and identity at the heart of social and cultural analysis. What is important is that he does not regard racism as a stand-alone single dimension separate from others, but instead he examines its relationality to other structures and social forces. Indeed, he has said that his interest lies less in race per se, but rather more in the process of racialization. How, why, and in what form do processes of racialization articulate with other features such as class or gender in a particular historical context, or conjuncture as he would have called it. In other words, although he never used the feminist term intersectionality, his work was no stranger to this analytic. In the late 70s and 1980s, Hall's work on issues of racism drew upon Marxist conceptual repertoire, especially the framework of Gramsci. Key Gramscian concepts such as common sense and hegemony, all rights, can extend conceptual horizons in the analysis of race and racism. Racialized discourses play a formative role in constructing the common sense of social groups and in the processes of securing consent for heterosexual politics. This analysis resonates with our own predicaments today, when the common sense is constructed through anti-immigrant rhetoric and a proliferation of a variety of racism, such as xeno-racism, anti-Muslim racism, anti-Jewish racism, and a variety of color-coded racism. These racisms position us differently in relation to one another. They have the potential of dividing us. They can place a wedge not merely between the dominant white groups and the racialized, but also amongst those differently racialized. That's important because those people who are racialized are also divided by different racism. Hence the critical need to combat all racisms. Throughout the 1970s until about 1986, the Marxist influence on Hall's writing on race and ethnicity remained marked. But the 1980s also saw a turn towards post-structuralist paradigms. His work on diaspora and what he termed new ethnicities, which I think Phil is going to speak about, was path-breaking, critiquing essentialism without dismissing out of court all forms of what the detractors often call identity politics. I think this is very important because people tend to use the term identity politics sometimes to dismiss the work of groups such as women or black people, etc. And he was someone who was very careful to take issue with certain types of identity politics, but at the same time he also understood that this was also necessary. The valorization of the concept of ethnicity posed serious challenges to the biological concept of racism as an inherent and immutable property of social groups. The use of the concept of diaspora was a critique of the racialized discourse of immigrants and of an overemphasis on the nation state. Diaspora in Hall is a global phenomenon that is marked by the histories of slavery, colonialism, imperialism, and Holocaust. In the late modern or postmodern context, diasporic experience emerges as one of multiplexedness, of multiplicity and hybridity. Stuart Hall was an astute analyst of social class. His early work on class was written during the late 1950s and the 1960s, and it charted changes in class identities. This was followed in 1978 by the monumental study Breaching the Crisis, co-written with 4 writers who were the then students at the Center of Cultural Studies and who later became eminent in their own right. This tome is a conjectural analysis par excellence, which addressed what they termed the crisis of the social order. This is something obviously we can be thinking about the crisis of the social order today, of pre-Thatcherite years. In a lecture televised on BBC in 1978, Hall identifies the salient features of this crisis. It was, he argued, a crisis that was simultaneously economic, political and ideological, and one that was represented through moral panics about race, youth and class. Addressing this ideological formation, often known as Powellism, with its dominant discourse consisting of the infamous rivers of blood speech and Enoch Powell's contention that minority ethnic groups could be in Britain but could never become of Britain, Hall's lecture anticipates the imminent emergence of Thatcherism, the term he said to have coined and the phenomena he analyzed in detail. Hall understood Thatcherism as a singularly significant and successful economic, political, and ideological project, promoting what he called authoritarian populism, again another concept very relevant for us today, that was accompanied by a massive swing to the right. This project was underpinned by discourses of mugging, law and order, social discipline, permissive society, and social anarchy. It conjured up images of racial dilution of national character. On the economic front, Thatcherism was characterized by monetarism, deregulation, privatization of key national industries, and a commitment to flexible labor markets. It mounted an onslaught on trade unions and argued for a minimal local and national state. This was a critical agenda for free markets, cuts in state funding, and cuts in taxes. Again, sounds quite familiar. It spawned a variety of nationalism which harked back to imperial glories and spoke of contemporary social threats to Britishness from enemies within. As Hall pointed out, Thatcherism deployed the discourse of nation and people against class and ignorance. His analysis of Thatcherism, especially the concept of authoritarian populism, is highly relevant to making sense of our own troubled times, when, with Brexit and the election of Donald Trump as the President of the United States, the political right has gained a great deal of ground in Europe and the USA. There are, of course, some differences between the formations of Thatcherism and a contemporary context. One of the dominant discourses which organizes our common sense today is that of austerity, which poses as a reasonably sounding edict which exhorts us to all tighten our belts and accept cuts for the great good of society. However, in a class-divided society, this is far from the case. The groups most explicitly targeted by racism today are migrants, refugees and asylum seekers, and Muslims, majority of whom are settlers, despite the media focus on refugees and asylum seekers. Though, of course, color-coded racism remains rife too. In the post-Brexit context, many individuals born here have been asked to go back to their homes. The politics of surveillance and the operations of the securitized state apparatus have now become far more entrenched. We live in a neoliberal world where the gap between the rich and the poor is widening, even as the deregulation which Thatcher instituted is somewhat curbed. Yet, there are similarities in the authoritarian populism of today and that of Thatcher years, and it is possible, for instance, to use Gramsci as Hall did. Hall's emphasis on culture as constitutive and his analysis of arts, cinematic practice, and the black diasporic subject offers acute insights for contemporary analysis. His work on identity is one of the most imaginative available. His critique of the century's notions of identity and his concept of identity as a process rather than as a finished product remains hugely important. His drawing upon psychoanalysis alongside discursive approaches to the theorization of identity has been productive and suggestive. Hall was an outstanding social and cultural analyst as well as a major public intellectual. It is a delight to be part of the launch of UEL PhD Studentship in his name. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara, for also being so good in terms of time. Of course, the whole focus of our discussion here is not just the legacy of Stuart, but now, during the age of fake news, travel bans, what is the relationship between migration, politics, and representation in the time of Trump visa. As Tara said, we were able to learn from Stuart Hall about Thatcherism and about New Labour. But what do we say about Brexit and about Trumpism within this context? Phil, now it's your turn.
Okay. Thank you, Nira. Okay, let's going to rewind a little bit. In June 1992, I don't think many of you were here then. I don't think Nira was here then.
No, of course, I was not born.
Okay. In June 1992, Stuart Hall came to the University of London, embarking, this is of it most of it then was, to give the inaugural lecture for the Centre for New Ethnicities Research, to which I've just been appointed director, partly at his instigation. I have to say, it was my first real job. I was about 40. It was the first job I had, and actually I had a pay packet at the end of the month. I've been working for a number of years at the Institute of Education as a sort of contract researcher, developing an approach to anti-racist education based on ethnographic work with young people in East London. As I'm sure I don't have to remind you, East London, and especially the Isle of Dogs, where much of this work took place, was then a front line of racial tension between a long-established working-class community traumatised by the closure of the docks, and more recently arrived Bangladeshi and Vietnamese Chinese communities. Barking was to come later. My research in East London has been partly focused on trying to understand the impact of deindustrialisation on the livelihoods, lifestyles and life stories of the people most directly affected and their families. Much of this involved working with children and young people wherever they were to be found, in classrooms and playgrounds, on the streets, in social housing estates. Educationally, it was an attempt to uncouple legitimate grievances about the impact of deindustrialisation, like the docks, on the customary pathways of transition from school to work, to uncouple these existential predicaments and the more hidden wounds of class which they articulated from the discourse of racialisation. The intervention was both required and hampered by the failure of the multicultural curriculum at that time to say much positive about the heritage of working class struggle unless it featured visible ethnic minorities, and also by a moral, symbolic and doctrinaire form of anti-racism which pressed the mute button on the expression of white working class grievances for fear that they might be construed as giving support to racist beliefs, which in some cases of course they did. The result was to even further alienate young people who already had little enough stake in the educational system or faith in its capacity to deliver on its meritocratic promises, and whose own collapsing narrative aspiration in any case bypassed it. That backlash has been a long time coming, but it could be argued that we are now reaping a real whirlwind. Against these tunnel visions, my work drew on concepts and methods from cultural studies, and of course in particular on Stuart Hall's work. Used photography, artwork, creative writing, visual ethnography to provide a space of representation in which young people's anxieties related to rapid demographic and socio-economic change could be freely ventilated, examined, worked through, and as far as possible, deracialised. I quickly came to the conclusion through this early work that to get to grips with racialised sentiment and belief, it was necessary to take the notion of unconscious racism much more literally. It was not just about the unintended consequences of institutional processes of discrimination or forms of prejudice of which the perpetrators were unaware or in denial. It was unconscious in the Freudian sense, a discourse of the other within the self. Stuart Hall was very supportive of this approach, not least because of the influence of Fanon on his own thinking and his close personal association with the world of psychoanalysis. In his conceptual model of ethnicities, which he elaborated in that inaugural lecture, he argues that ethnicity is not necessarily ethnocentric. It does not have to be about autochthony, aboriginality, or autopoiesis. It is not inevitably racially fixated or essentialized. He detected the emergence of a new form of ethnicity which was decentered, fluid, situational, variable in its articulation, hybridized, allopoetic, and undergoing constant transformation. In other words, postmodern. It became our research task to put this construct under empirical pressure to investigate what the normative concept of new ethnicities corresponded to in the cultural practices, identity work, and coming-of-age stories of young people growing up in a part of London which for over 2 centuries has been home to immigrants and refugees from all over the world, as well as to a large English working-class population drawn from different parts of the UK and Ireland. One of our first projects was called Tricks of the Trade, and involved producing educational materials for 10 to 14-year-old children for the British Film Institute. We chose the theme of the trickster because we were inspired by a book by Henry Louis Gates called The Signifying Monkey. I don't know if anyone knows the book, but it's certainly worth looking at. His account of the role of the trickster figure in black diasporic culture, especially in its street vernaculars of sounding, signifying, and talking the dozens, which of course is the foundations of rap. Our idea was to twin Anansi, the black Spider-Man, whose exploit in using his wits to turn the tables on the powers that be was a staple ingredient of Caribbean folklore, with his white American counterpart, the hero of the all-American dream as portrayed by Marvel Comics. Well, there you can see This is kind of hard to signify time, but there you can see the spider over there, and we reinterpreted the trickster figure. So we have one version of the trickster figure who's a kind of businessman over here, and we have here a figure that represents different, kind of a dance form, which is linked to some of the themes that we're exploring in the project. And embedded in there is lots of elements of different kinds of histories, such as slavery, corporate capitalism, and so on and so forth. So we use that as a kind of matrix image for the project. And the aim was to explore issues of power, knowledge, legacy of cultural colonialism in an imaginative way by getting children to create stories in which Anansi meets a spider woman. And we produced a book for the BFI, you probably can't see, but it's got, there's spider woman and there's Anansi. So they made up all sorts of stories, including, interestingly enough, portraying the Cockney as a trickster, who was kind of part shapeshifter, part ducker and diver. So they kind of reinterpreted it in that kind of way. So on the occasion of Stuart's visit to give the inaugural CNR lecture, I seized the time to interview him about Anansi. And if you want to, you can go onto my website. You can actually hear, we used his interview as a sort of narrative for a film we made about the project, called Tricks of the Trade. He reminisced about his childhood growing up in Jamaica and the Anansi stories he had told. What I like about Anansi, he said, is that he knew how to live on both sides of the line. In other words, Anansi knew how to fool the powerful into thinking that he was on their side, he could be trusted as their man to do their bidding, and then use that position to undermine their authority and get his own way. You can see why children love these stories. Living on both sides of the line is what Stuart Hall did most of his life. He was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, the founder of a new academic discipline, an internationally known cultural commentator, as Avatar mentioned. He was certainly a fully paid up member of the intellectual elite, so currently castigated by the Daily Mail and the populist alt-right. But he was also an anti-establishment figure, a man of the New Left, a political activist, or an organic black intellectual who belonged to a distant academy populated by artists and writers who held the world, according to Mrs. Thatcher, in contempt. When he turned up to the CNER lecture, he was wearing a sober and extremely expensive suit and tie, but he looked rather uncomfortable in it, as if he longed to take off the jacket, tear off the tie, and let the dance of his mind become a more directly embodied performance. Talking on his feet, combining Benjamin-esque subtle dialectic with Brechtian crude thoughts was his special forte. Living on both sides of the line is also, of course, what new ethnicities are supposed to be about. The capacity to switch codes, negotiate multiple identities, feel at home in difference, and most definitely not feel torn between two cultures or conflicting value systems. Now, one problem with this model of identity work, in some hands anyway, is that it tends to set up a binary opposition in styles of identity work between healthy, happy hybridity at one normative pole and pathological purity at the other, in a way which, it could be argued, fails to grasp the lived complexities of race, class and gender in contemporary Britain. Secondly, in some hands, it conjures up the exemplary figure of a nomadic subject in a way which conflates the privileged cosmopolitanism, privileged cosmopolitan lifestyle of multicultural omnivores and globetrotters with the denizens of the gig economy who from economic necessity have to engage in the just-in-time production of the self, and also with the situation of diasporic peoples who have been forcibly uprooted from their homeland as a result of famine, war or persecution, all kind of lumped in this kind of category of the nomadic subject. But the fact is the precarious circumstances of such groups do not admit the luxury of living on both sides of the line, where the line in question is that drawn between survival or extinction. In the 8 years of its existence, the CNER carried out a wide range of pedagogic cultural action linked to ethnographic research, which put the notion of new ethnicity under empirical pressure. In our biggest project, Finding the Way Home, we carried out a comparative study of young people's sense of place, identity and belonging related to issues of gender, ethnicity and class in two ex-Dockland areas of London, Deptford and the Isle of Dogs, and two equally contrasting districts of Hamburg. We used a gamut of methods from picture preference tests of youth fashions to guided fantasy exercises, photo story making, video walkabouts and narrative interviews to create a multi-layered representation of these young people's coming-of-age stories and how these were influenced by different local histories and geographies of immigration and racism in each city. I can't possibly summarise findings there. The book's finding the way home you can also get hold of. But the crucial indicator we found in the style of identity work being pursued was the amount and type of cultural and social capital at these young people's disposal. And that was primarily a function of familial, not educational resources. Those with the most going for them in terms of social and cultural capital, what Robert Putnam calls the bridging capital, had the confidence to experiment with lifestyle choices, to try out different gender roles, to reach out to make friendships and other partnerships with young people with very different social backgrounds, to rehearse imaginatively a new class identity, and generally embrace the conviviality of urban multiculture, its hybridized ethnicities and stylistic mashups. In other words, to live both sides of the line. Access to bridging capital equipped these young people with a disposition to see the world, if not as their oyster, then as a safe place for their encounter with the other, albeit with a few dangerous or exciting hotspots. So that's the good news. The bad news is that those who had least going for them, for whom Dr. Putnam calls the bonders, bonding capital he's talking about, they needed to create defensible spaces of identity work in order to maintain some sense of ontological security. These spaces were often strongly territorialised and anchored to fixed positions of gender, ethnicity and class. The world was seen as a dangerous place, offering little prospect of the future, but with a few safe bolt holes where the other could be kept at bay. Bonders were more likely to draw the line under their own feet, to overreact to any kind of change, and to feel most threatened by the arrival on their doorstep of new immigrants. We found that in both cities, it was the young people who self-identified as being working class and who had the least social and cultural capital, and those are two distinct issues. Those who both self-identified as working class and had the least social and cultural capital, they were the most likely to adopt this kind of defensive position, to bond only with those who seem to be like them in terms of youth styles or tribes. However, we also found that the balance between ethnic bonding and bridging varied according to local circumstance, and that many young people toggled between the two positions. There were also some who shifted decisively from one position to the other, actually in the course of our own research, partly as a result of things that actually happened to their lives, quite contingent things that you couldn't predict, and you couldn't react, you couldn't read off from their ethnic or class categorisation, which route they would take. So that's found again, family and peer group cultures were the key intervening variables. We concluded that old ethnicities had not withered away, but in some contexts had been reinvigorated as a defensive response to hyperdiversity, while new ethnicities were largely confined to those who could take advantage of the creative opportunities they offered for self-advancement. Now that's a snapshot taken over maybe 15 years ago of a scenario which in recent months we've become a bit too familiar. Stuart Hall would have recognised it for sure, but he would also, I think, have admitted it was time to revise some of the terms in which we understand it. We are in a different political conjuncture in which soft internal borders are being overwritten by hard external ones, creating new topographies of exclusion, cutting across familiar lines of ideological division, while at the same time re-territorialising old lines of division. Populism, in both its authoritarian and libertarian instances, is a bonder's charter. It summons into being a virtuous, homogeneous, aboriginal people polarised against a cosmopolitan elite who have imported alien cultural goods into the country and become the new enemy within. The demand to take back control, with its echo of working class syndicalism and popular sovereignty, reverberates both with the desire for protection against the precarities of deregulated labour and housing markets, and the equally strong desire to re-regulate a moral economy of community around more stable, less permissive styles of identity work, so that growing up working class can once again become an apprenticeship to a viable inheritance. In addressing rather than dismissing these concerns, we have to ensure that those who once upon a time were regarded by the left, and who often regarded themselves as the backbone of the nation, are not now demonised by that same left as a race apart, mired in false consciousness, unfit for the purposes of socialism as they are for global capitalism, and just because they voted for Brexit. The great moving right show has moved on to terra incognita, and we need to find new concepts and new strategies to meet that challenge. Otherwise, as the man himself once put it, we're in for a dumpy, I say dumpy, but bumpy ride. Leaving with this, I've just say, as a coder, when I arrived to Liverpool by boat from Belfast and had to enter the immigration border control there, this was the image. This is what greeted me. This is what we were coming over from Belfast. We arrived on these shores. This was the statement that was put up. And I'd just like you to think, when we come back to the discussion, is just imagine that this same poster, this was up there, was actually in Belfast. And the first thing you saw when you arrived from Liverpool into the harbour at Belfast, how might things have been changed around?
It's along from Jamaica. Thank you very much. Obviously, as with Carol's vision and Tim, there are a lot of things to think about. The relationship between, as you said, the internal and the external line, or in the work that we've been doing between everyday bordering and between autochthonic populist policies at the moment. Ash, your turn.
Hi, how you doing? Thanks. It's always going to be a little bit of a challenge after noted Bill kind of noted Stuart students to say something critically new about students' legacy. What I want to do, or the way I want to sort of talk about this, is actually think about contemporary migration and the contemporary sort of discourses around migration. And in the spirit of a debate, so I'm just going to make a set of kind of points, and maybe in the spirit of being slightly polemical, to kind of have a bit of a debate around these questions. I think one of the kind of problematic moments we're at is that there's so much discourse around migration now, from all sorts of sources, and particularly I want to say something about the contemporary sort of communication networks, particularly around social media, and how migrancy is such a significant topic in all sides, left, right, etc., etc. And it's quite difficult to make sense of the politics of some of the discourses themselves. And I do want to focus a little bit on the sort of politics of representation in this contemporary world, and link it to some of the work that actually Avatar and Phil have actually speaking about. And as I think one of the problems that leads to challenge, I think, in thinking about migrants and migrancy and the whole set of cluster of terms around it, that it sort of acts as a code, a shorthand, as something assumed we already know in economic, political, social, cultural discourses. And I want to suggest maybe as a critical term, particularly if you want to work with it as a kind of progressive way of thinking about contemporary politics, it's maybe losing its effectiveness. It's somewhat problematically positioned in a whole set of conservative discourses. So in a sense, I want to say not to jettison the term migrant, but as sort of people working within traditional studies, to start to unpack and start to rethink when we begin to use the term migrant to migrancy, whether that's a productive way of engaging in some of those political debates. So I want to say that. Because I think partly the problem of, so maybe we should just jettison the term and start rethink again what it means to talk about politically, socially, critically around what we call people who are migrants. I think there's a kind of problematic around that. It sort of acts as an empty signifier, a symptom for many things, as we know. And much of that has little to do with migrants themselves. You know, in that sense, and to evoke Stuart Hall's work, as Avatar actually did, it seems to function in a similar way to the discourse of the mugger in the 1970s. The migrant seems to have occupied a similar way in his seminal study, Policing the Crisis, and as Avatar articulated, the shift to authoritarian populism. There, the analysis saw the figure of the mugger as a symptom, a sign of anxiety with the crisis of state, capital, and the social that condensed upon. And I think to some degree, as it's been suggested, the sort of interdisciplinary study that Policing the Crisis undertook, a multidisciplinary study, is necessary to understand the place of migrancy and the migrants within the broader social and political and economic spheres of the nation, but of Europe, and increasingly globally. I think one of the shifts and changes that I want to sort of hint towards or think about is the kind of increasing role of kind of social media, new communications, new forms of, new environments of how discourses and politics operate within this new technological sphere. And we can talk about that a little bit more. The other thing, just to say, why I think the discourse of migrancy is somewhat problematic in some respects, I'm simplifying, is there's a sort of tendency in some work to kind of ignore the question of race and ethnicity, to privilege the question of the border as someone between inside and outside. And so I think one of the problems of migrancy, and a lot of the critical work on that, is it tends to sort of suggest we just need to let them in, right? Where actually you get in and it's bad. And it's not so much of being a migrant, it's about racism and xenophobia within the nation state. And that affects everyone, and I don't think the question that they're migrants is a particularly exceptional one in that respect. Or at least I wanted to signal the talk of borders is inadequate, and we need to think about the social formation in relation to questions of institutional everyday racism. You know, the university, for instance, is a kind of border police force. It's part of a whole set of discourses around the university, the role of the university. So I just want to sort of signal the sort of problematic realm of how migrants operate within certain kind of spaces. What I want to focus on a little bit more is how the current debate around migrancy, critical, popular, is figured around the idea of visibility. The idea of visibility. And so a lot of the conservative, reactionary, right-wing, governmental discourses around making the migrant visible. It's about making the migrant visible as in terms of security, militarization, border controls. It's all about identifying who the migrant is, and then trying to identify whether they have any right to be in a place or not, whether they have the right documents, etc., etc. There's a whole set of politics around visibility and control and biopolitics and governance, and that work is very much structured around making them visible. I think there's also a set of more kind of liberal progressive projects which also operate around the construction of the migrant as a visible object, which is very much around, in terms of identifying the number of dead in the Mediterranean, for instance. You know, they're in terms of thinking about the stories of passage, for instance. There's a whole heap of, if you follow the art projects in Europe at the moment, there's a lot of art projects which are all about somehow mapping in various ways and documenting. And in a way, they're all quite worthy projects, but they're also about a certain type of visibility. And I think one of the problems of much of the work around migrancy and the discourses where the popular academic seems to be around a certain type of visibility for some non-migrant subject. Right? So much of the work is structured by a European gaze looking outwards. Sorry. Yeah, it's probably some monitoring thing. So much of the work and much of the studies, even some of the more kind of sympathetic and liberal ones, are still structured, I would argue, for instance, in the context of Europe, through a sort of empathetic visibilization of the migrant, but the relations of power between Europe and the non-European seems to be still reproduced, even in its kind of empathetic, sympathetic discourse. I think that opens up a whole set of debates about the ethical and about what we do politically, socially, and academically. And I think that kind of produces the quite problematic discourses, for instance, around trying to label the good migrant from the bad migrant. You know, the good migrant from the bad migrant seems to be a very prevalent discourse within, of course, the kind of security, governmental discourses, the legal discourses. But actually, it's also true to try to defend the migrants as kind of proper citizens. proper subjects. They're just like us. You know, there's a whole sort of discourse of assimilation within a more liberal discourses, which is saying they should be citizens like us, to reduce the migrant to the image of us. And I think that's kind of deeply problematic, that sort of moralism around what's a proper subject, what's not a proper subject. And I think one of the problems to think about is the question of autarity, and also a debate about an ethical relationship to otherness which enables the other to be other, not to be reducible to the kind of European subject at all, and whether citizenship itself should be the criteria of being a person who lives in the country, etc., etc. These hierarchies of subjectivity. I mean, the other thing to say about a lot of the contemporary work around migrancy is that much of it is very presentist. It's about now, and there's an urgency of political moment about now, and I understand that, but it's presentist. So we know very little about history, memory, and about people's actual journeys and travels, right? A lot of the work, in the political imperative work, ignores the whole problematic of why there is migration, etc., etc., right? And interestingly, that reproduces a sort of discourses of good and bad between victim so between a victim discourse and one of criminality, for instance. So there's a whole set of very reductive discourses around migration, which is problematic. And I think we do need to think through some of whether migration as the way to think about what is actually a normative structure of people moving is a way to think about and defend the fact that some Africans want to live in Europe. You know, that movement already happens, but migrancy is adequate enough term to think about the movement of large scales of people is something to think about. I actually think, instead of trying to make the migrant visible, worthy as that might be, is that one needs to think about the sort of migrant subjectivity outside the sort of logics of visibility, outside the logics of a Eurocentric subjectivity. And I think one of the interesting things, while the story of contemporary migration is brutal, violent, destructive, and actually tragic in all sorts of ways. I mean, it's absolutely, if history now is to tell the story, it's disgraceful, Europe's position on migrancy and America's one, there's no doubt. But one of the things sort of absent from a lot of the discourses is actually the levels of resistance. You know, the levels of resistance and how people carry on, in spite of the brutality, in spite of the exclusions, and how people survive and make their lives and do enter the space. And I want to suggest that one of the things we may want to think about is the way of kind of hope, utopia, possibility. It's a bad moment, but actually there is resistance and survival. One of the heartening things about the contemporary moments about migrant debate is, as much as the brutality is happening, there's a lot of support for migrants as well, refugees, migrants and stuff, and it's an interesting moment in that respect. You know, places which are not known for their anti-racism, etc., come out supportive of migrants, partly being driven by social media, etc., etc. So I do think, while it's a kind of pessimistic moment in all sorts of ways, one does need to think about politics and critical work that tries to engage with the forms of resistances and forms of utopian projects that enable people to live lives beyond from their situations that they come from. And I think one of the things to recognise is not to polarize migrant bad, victim, criminal, etc., is to recognise the contradictions, the good and bad. Of course, some migrants are going to be patriarchal, that migrants are going to be criminalising in various sorts of ways. And I think one of the things to think about is the tensions and contradictions between power and resistance, shall we say. It's slightly simplified. And in a way, the tradition of Stuart Hall's work, as I think actually Phil and Atta attested to, is about thinking about those questions of lived experience as much as about forms of repressive power. And I think by focusing on migrants' lived experience and how they negotiate the forms of power is quite an important part of the trajectory to think about the possibilities of thinking differently about migrancy. And Neera's waving at me, I'm not sure why, but I'm sure it's to wind up. So I haven't got time, but I want to suggest that one of the important ways of thinking about the way representation of migrancy, and Phil mentioned it, is that Stuart, over his time, was very committed to the visual arts and to analysing media and analysing forms of cultural photography, etc. And a lot of Black British artists were heavily influenced by Stuart's work. And he himself was very influenced by the artist's work. And what's interesting about a lot of that work, a lot of the themes and ideas around identity, subjectivity, diaspora, migration, has been taking place for a long period of time. And I think it's an important resource in terms of thinking about how we might think about migrant subjectivity from the position of the migrants, from a position of diaspora, as opposed to from a sort of position of kind of othering. And I think the questions, what's central to that work is the question of memory, history, and the way subjectivities are caught up in a complex set of movements and histories. But I'll stop it there. Thank you.
You raised a lot of important issues. This is why, for example, in our research, we use situated intersectionality as a methodological in order to avoid some of the pitfalls that you mentioned. But in terms of visibility, I want to remind people that last Monday was a day in which all of us migrants, with all the heterogeneity, were showing ourselves, withdrawing ourselves, signifying that things are not as they should be. And there was a lot of support to this kind of activity. And I just want very quickly to mention in terms of resistance, and we talked about the university, I hope all of you are going to support this group that are leading a campaign, Let Us Learn, for refugees and migrants to be allowed to study in British University. We are going to organize a special event about this issue, but please give them support as well. Gary, your turn.